I'm Matt Guichard, and this is No Holds Barred. In this episode, we're going to talk about domestic violence. We have 4 special guests. We're going to have a conversation about domestic violence and the challenges faced by not just our 4 special guests, but anyone who's ever experienced domestic violence. What I want to do is kind of get back to, for a minute, to what Nicolette was talking about, and that is that if she could go to Contra Costa County and get a copy of a restraining order, I guarantee that restraining order is with the Department of Justice. So there was a time when the courts weren't interconnected, but now they're all interconnected, and information is available. So within the state of California, no police officer, my daughter included, should show up at somebody's house without being armed with the information about an individual, if in fact they have the identity when they showed up of an individual. A lot of times you get their ID or get their name and go out in the car and run it on the computer, and you can gather all kinds of information that we couldn't get in the past, or that police couldn't get in the past. And in the district attorney's office, I could get a lot of stuff on computers. Nowadays, you can get a lot more. So I think first and foremost, to protect society, it should be that if restraining orders are public documents, then you shouldn't have to go hire a private PI and hope that, let's see, Contra Costa, Sacramento, Solana, where else might he have lived, and run that down. That is one way to do it, which some people do, but I would think a database for a public document that doesn't violate anyone's privacy rights because it's a public document. Yeah, Annabelle.
And to tag on to also that other part of, yes, I'm glad that Nicolette was able to gather that information, but she brought up a good point earlier, was that her abuser would change his name just by a couple of the spellings. So if someone is searching for that particular restraining order, if they know that they were in that county, if they know they had an idea of the area that they were in, but they changed their name or it was misspelled somehow, or they go through aliases, that's not going to come up. And so that's the problem. So we're just hoping that even if you start searching for it, there is the sounds like the phonetic spelling, and anything like that would come up. So it's just really hard if they.
So let's get down to the. Yeah. So the concept is you before you entered into a relationship with somebody, or just like if you were hiring a babysitter or somebody to coach your kids or something, you want the ability to run a background on them to see whether or not they have any restraining orders or anything against them. So going to the same level as coaching or anything like that, or teaching, you're driving buses, you all have to be live scanned, and it all goes to DOJ, and the information comes back. That's going to require a lot of work. I do think that educating our legislators is a big part of this, because that's where this goes. I think individual people could do, like Nicolette, you've talked about, could say, well, he lived in Contra Costa County. I'm going to, and I have his true and correct name. I'm going to particularly look. But did you look after the fact? In other words, you looked after the abuse to find out if he had a restraining order.
Yeah, well, this is someone other. This isn't the person I'm in court with now. This is someone I was told had a restraining order, and I wanted to see how easily it was for me to obtain it.
Okay.
So
and
since
you
I
found
had
it,
the name,
yeah.
very
Just
easy.
tell us how
Yes.
long did it take for you to either go online or call the clerk's office to actually get that information?
I want to say about 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah. Well, timing is everything, and so sometimes that's thinking 3 or 4 weeks. That's a long time. You need to find out something pretty quickly. But yeah, I'm happy to date you, but you're going to have to wait 3 or 4 weeks until I run a background on you. But I
Exactly.
really like you a lot, but I tell you what, I need the last four of your social. I need your full true name. I need to look at your birth certificate. And I'm going to run you. And then if it all comes back, I might I'll let you in my house. That's that.
That sounds
Yes,
about
no.
right.
That's a that is a concept. Well, kind of circling back, let's get back to the concept of, I mean, that's a problem. And it's an information thing, and that's significant to find out. But what I want to say, it's either after the fact that you would get the information, because find out about this person, and then get very angry to find out that this has happened before, and with that same person. And, why didn't I know? And then it is the getting up front about the person. Okay, you want to date me? Here's an application form. You can fill it out. I'll get back to you. I know some people have suggested that in the past, but that's usually not how it works, but it might have to work sometime in the future. But what I want to talk about now is kind of the frustration that we've all talked about. What can we do so that there is a place that somebody could go and look, not violate the average person's privacy rights or anything, but find out if there is a restraining order on file, or goodness, if they've been convicted of some kind of heinous crime, some rape, robbery, murder, or whatever. You want, wait a minute. I want to know this ahead of time. We want to keep it kind of focused on domestic violence because that is the subject. And clearly it is a huge problem in our society. And as I have often mentioned, I do all the law enforcement involved fatal incident cases in Contra Costa County and some other counties. I don't know if the four of you may have recalled the two women who adopted 6 kids out of Texas and lived in several states and abused them a great deal and eventually drove off the cliff in Mendocino County, killing everyone. The Hart family inquest. So I did that, and it was a story that the sheriff of Mendocino County wanted to get and have us do this inquest and this whole story. YouTube now, all you can see the Hart family inquest, because how could a system work where it happened in Texas and then it happened in Minnesota, and those same kids were then taken to Oregon, and just before things then moved to Washington, and then finally driven to California. And each one of those different states, there was a history of abuse of these children, and it ended up in a death in Mendocino County, California. And the sheriff's question, how could this happen? How could we have missed all of this? And I think tonight we want to talk about, or today we want to talk about, getting a database in place so that this doesn't happen. There is information about individuals, and we're not even talking about what we do with those individuals to try to make them not be perpetrators. We're just initially talking about, let's find out who they are. Let's find out how we protect you and the victims. Let's talk about what the courts can do, what the district attorney's office can do. And so there's an awful lot on our plate, and I think we could have lots of discussions about this, about where we go from here, because we've understood the problem, we've addressed the problem, but we certainly haven't solved the problem. And so I think the first step is addressing that it's a problem. And I think, as we mentioned from the start, we have these special units in the DA's office. We have special courts. But it doesn't seem that the domestic violence abuse has lessened in any fashion. In fact, it almost seems that it's increased. I don't know why that is. And maybe it's a result of bringing it to the fore, that maybe it happened just as much in the past, but it just wasn't reported. And now we're recognizing it and we're reporting it. It's probably the better answer. That's probably really what's happening. But what do we do? What do we do? So we've heard about going to court. So let's, Sarah, let's get back to you a little bit. Tell me a little bit of perhaps anecdotally, or what you've heard about why it's frustrating for people to go to court, not because it's been rolled over into family court, which is what happens an awful lot. But when you go to court, you have the sense that the court is taking the time to listen to you and listen to what your concerns are, or it's just in your experience, just moving them on through.
So I think, well, my primary experience is with the family court. So that's mostly what I can speak to. I haven't limited experience with domestic violence court. I do think, though, that from what I've experienced and from my colleagues who work in other organizations across the country, there's actually very little training specific to domestic violence. And,
Let
you
me
know, I
just
know
interrupt you
some,
there.
oh, yeah,
In what way? In what, I mean, training with just
right.
everyone, or training with
No,
the
I would say
police or the
specifically in
courts or
law
anything?
enforcement. I would say
Yeah.
specifically in law enforcement and district attorney staff. I think that, there's a sort of a minimal requirement, which is, I think, and again, you can speak to this more, Matt, I'm sure, but very few hours, I think, required around this type of very specific training. And the training that's received may or may not be the most recent, right? Research-based, evidence-based training. I think oftentimes it's based on something that's outdated. And so we have a lot more recent information about, again, as we were chatting about, different types of domestic violence, how it manifests, right, in relationships, and what that really looks like, especially when you're dealing with women and children, because then you have a power differential, right? So we're not talking about, sort of even across the board power dynamics. We're talking about somebody who is typically financially dependent, typically has caregiving roles, which would keep them from being in a more sort of even reciprocal situation with their perpetrator. And so I think that's often not looked at. And I think it's something that's very important to look at because mothers and children are dependent, right? We do have to look at that piece of it, and the training is not there. And
Yeah.
if it were there, and I think there's actually a lot of, if I'm recalling correctly, in Canada, there's some in British Columbia, I think you can check it out. But I believe they've actually retrained a lot of their law enforcement crews to reflect the current situation and current research on what it looks like to be in a domestic violence and or coercive control situation and how they're responding to that differently. So I think there's models out there. I just think we're not implementing them.
Okay, so here's my thought. That takes in a lot, and so you're using the they a lot, and of course that's a big issue. Is police training, court training, perhaps district attorney training. My understanding is, and I can't say it because I don't know, I haven't been involved in the units, and my understanding is there is domestic violence training for those people that are specifically assigned in district attorneys' offices because there are state grants that fund some of these units. So there is some training. But clearly, as we know, the police have all kinds of training they're aware of now. You name it, there's all kinds of classes and training, but it appears that there obviously needs to be more training. I would say, Sarah, we'll give you a homework assignment, is find out about what's happening in Canada and some of those things anecdotally that you've heard about, because I think it's important. I think there isn't a police chief who wouldn't say, Sarah's going to come in and give us a class with a couple other people, Annabelle and this person named Caitlin and Nicolette. They're going to teach us about how to approach this, and here are some of the things to look at and that you might see, because that's the only way that gets done is somebody comes and says, hey, this is something that isn't being recognized. We probably get a little pushback, and I'd like to find out, really, are police agencies training people in domestic violence, not just the idea of showing up and seeing somebody frightened or seeing a bruise on them, are they understanding that it can take all kinds of domestic violence is a much bigger issue than simply somebody twisting the arm of his or her spouse or girlfriend or child or whatever. It's a much bigger thing, because I always agree that education is the best thing. I will say one of the huge problems that we have is police are hopelessly outnumbered now. Every agency, people don't want to be police officers. You can talk in Sacramento, Oakland, San Francisco, everywhere, saying they're having a terrible time recruiting. And so they're jumping from this call to this call to this call to this call, and really don't have the time or not taking the time to kind of recognize some of the issues that you're talking about. So it's, I don't want to play a blame game or anything. I just say it's a big problem and it clearly needs to be addressed. And lots of victims of domestic violence out there. And I think, as Nicolette mentioned, many police officers are at risk because they're showing up in a domestic violence situation, which in many cases is highly emotional, and walking up the sidewalk, shots ring out and the officers die. And we hear about it every single day. And as I was saying before, I do we call them leafy, law enforcement involved fatal incident coroner's inquests here in Contra Costa County and some others. And I can't tell you the number of police shooting cases or somebody dies, and the genesis of it was through a domestic violence case. And you often think of, okay, the court says we want you to go to an anger management class, and here's this piece of paper that says you don't get to call them up on the phone, and that in many cases is not solving the problem. It's
I think to speak, if I may, Matt, I didn't mean to cut
absolutely.
you off, but I really do think that what we're lacking in a lot of situations and many organizations, I mean, law enforcement, I'm not trying to place, undue blame on law enforcement, because I think, right, we need to share the responsibility for the safety of our citizens. And I do believe, though, that survivor-led initiatives, right, folks who have been through trauma and pain and abuse, going in, as you mentioned, right, going in and providing actual real-time, real-life educational experiences for these organizations who oversee, right, the safety of our society. I think that's crucial. I think it's very hard to really acknowledge or grapple with something, honestly, unless you lived it. That's my that's my opinion. And I think we have a lot of experts out there who may be well qualified, have wonderful education. I'm actually getting my doctorate right now, so I have nothing against education, but I do think that unless you've lived something, experienced it, gone through it, right? So survivor-led initiatives do really feel the most valid if we want to find real solutions.
Yeah. Well, I completely agree. And I don't know if any of you have sat in on a hearing up in Sacramento, just our local legislature, where people will come forward at a committee hearing. So many times we change laws because somebody came before the legislature, they had a committee hearing, and people spoke, just like you. And here's an issue. And that raises the consciousness of the legislature and says, here is a problem that we need to address. I can guarantee you, without knowing at all, that domestic violence has been raised as an issue in the California legislature, just because they're funding units, courts, domestic violence courts, and units of the district attorney's office. But sometimes what happens is, okay, we've done our job, we kind of move on. I think we need to come back after a period of time and say, okay, what we did, is that working? What needs to be tweaked? And I think the four of you are perfect. That's why this discussion, when I talked about sitting here and asking you a question, I thought this is perfect because I've been in that unit and I do understand. I've certainly been in court many times on restraining orders and speaking with people about it. But I'm not, I'm not a victim. I can talk, okay, I was a DA and this is what happened. Well, that doesn't really resonate. It's with people that said, look, this is what happened to me in the system and it didn't work. So what can we do to fix that? And so it's a much greater issue than simply training the police, although that certainly is one area, but it's an issue of making the courts understand that, this, and I don't know how you do it. That person that you just ordered not to have any contact with them walks right outside the courthouse and confronts them literally right there in front of bailiffs outside the courtroom. Well, how does that piece of paper that the judge just signed, how does that do anything? So that's a very, very difficult thing. And as you know, you all probably know, that is part of the unit that I also used to have at another time, and that's the homicide unit. And domestic violence in many cases results in homicides, not just as we're talking about police officers walking up the sidewalk, but getting to the house and somebody's died in a domestic violence, in a rage. And I can't tell you the number of cases. I used to say that murder is the most selfish crime. I would say that to jury. Why is that? Because you abuse somebody and they threaten to leave you and you kill them. If anyone should die in a situation like that, it's you. Because if you can't handle it, you selfishly take somebody else's life when you're the one that thinks you're the victim. How selfish is that? And homicide, murder cases are often exactly like that. But that's what we find. Somebody doesn't go to the Bay Bridge and jump off because their spouse is leaving them. In many cases, they go kill their spouse. Well, wait a minute. So it's such a huge problem, and it so impacts our court systems, our public safety, and family law. I mean, in family law, and that's where these emotions just kick in. And I'll ask you, Sarah, if there was one thing you could fix, that's all, but you could wave a magic wand, one thing you could fix about this domestic violence system that we have, what's the first thing that you would want to fix? And you could all kind of figure out, I'm going to ask each one of you.
That's a $1 million question.
So I'm starting with Sarah. What's that?
I said it's a $1 million question, isn't it, Matt? Yeah. And before I answer that, I just want to acknowledge that, Nikki, your incredible tenacity and vision and perseverance in starting this organization. Nikki invited us all onto her amazing, boat here of success with Are They Abusive? And I'm really honored and grateful. Again, my belief is survivor-led initiatives all the way. And Nikki is a survivor. Her children are survivors. And this is, what I want to support. This is what I think we should be supporting as a society. So I wanted to start with that. But in response to your question, I think the biggest thing for me is you need to believe the victim, right? We are a victim blaming society. We are still really entrenched in that. And you don't have to look very far, right? Any high profile, Jeffrey Epstein sort of case. And there's lots of them out there. And those are the media attention focused, cases. And we're really talking about the everyday cases, right? The everyday victims, the everyday women and children primarily. I am not saying it doesn't happen to men, but, it is a gendered issue. Let's be real. Every day in, day out, women and children are suffering. And I think one of the primary reasons is because they are not believed. We are not believed. And so if we really want to turn this around, we need to be believed, right? Children have to be believed. Women have to be believed. And that, I think, will kind of catapult us into the next real tangible state of change around this issue.
Well, I'm going to say it was an unfair question. I'm going to ask each one of you because there's not just one answer, but it was what I wanted, what each one of you, from your own personal feelings, what if you could just do one thing. So getting to what Sarah says about believing, that is a huge problem, because how our criminal justice system works is the burden is on the prosecution. So the defense doesn't have to prove anything. So the first thing that you find so troubling in any kind of a case is that, wait a minute, that person who committed the crime has a lawyer that's saying, they grew up poor and their father beat them, they were a victim of domestic violence, all these things, not thinking about the victim, it's thinking about the perpetrator. So why did they do it, and how can we lessen any sanction against them? So that is a real problem. So believing, I think the average police officer who shows up and it recognizes standing on the sidewalk with a baby in the freezing cold, that with tears, that's a victim. I believe her. However, what's the next step? What even believing what can be done? And that's where things seem to slip between the cracks. And every one of us knows, we've read in the newspaper about that person and some terrible homicide, and then what we hear about over the week, here are the 10 clues and the 11 things that happened that nobody acted on, or they acted on in such a fashion that it really didn't solve the problem. So Annabelle, I've been blabbing on about that, but I'll ask you the same question, kind of from your perspective. What is something gosh, if we could just do this, and it can't be the same as Sarah's.
No, well, you actually touched on it, and you're talking about action. So from my perspective, and also in believing the victim, the survivor, once that restraining order is put in place, I think there needs to be an action plan put together in order to that is feasible for the survivor, the person that's being protected. Because here's the thing, when they gave me that restraining order, that was it. They gave the instructions that we can't be around each other, call the police. But really, what tangible action items would I be able to have to feel safe? I mean, that's something I know that has a lot to do with funding, but really, and I know that people are like, oh, you can't tell me how to live my life, you can't tell me where to go or whatnot. But if somebody actually told me, these are the things that you can do to make yourself and your family feel safe, and these are like an action plan, that would have helped me a lot more than just that piece of paper. Guidance, basically. More guidance, more assistance, more support for the victims and the survivors after that restraining order is put in place. And I think that's actually a lot that's feasible to do.
Yeah, well, that's actually interesting you should say that, because a statistic that I was recently told about by a friend of mine who does family law is that the vast majority of people that go into family court are in pro per, they're unrepresented. And the vast majority of people who go for restraining orders are unrepresented. So, and that's just how the system works. And people say, I can't afford a lawyer. Now, we do have lawyers referral service. We have all kinds of things to help people. When it gets really bad, we have shelters that we put people in. But most people go in, I want this restraining order. They get somebody to help them fill it out. They go to court. Let's say the perpetrator doesn't even show up. The court goes, bingo, you win. Here's a restraining order. Make sure it gets served on him and give it to the police department in the town where he works and where he lives. And thank you very much, you're done.
Exactly.
And you're going, okay, I feel pretty darn good. He can't do all these things on this, but that's no help. I will say, when I've been involved in restraining orders, and I haven't ever in domestic violence cases, except back when I was a DA, but sometimes just people say, look, listen, it's a family thing and there's fights over money or anything. So I've sat in and I've watched what happens. I often say, so important to have an attorney, because you can explain things, and in many cases go talk to the other side and explain, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do, this is what you can do. But in this kind of situation, I could just see going in and getting it. Now what do I do? You feel comfortable, but guess what? You very quickly learn that there's no comfort in that, because if the person is who that person is, they don't care about a piece of paper in many times. In fact, in many times, being served with it enrages them and makes them even worse than before you went in. And I've certainly seen experience with that. Caitlin, what do you think? Your magic wand.
Oh, where do I begin? So just to say something about what you were saying with the piece of paper thing, I actually had a judge who said that to me. I pretty much said, chalk it up as, in Sacramento court, I don't know what else you want from us. We gave you a piece of paper. That's as far as we can, go to protect you. That's literally what the judge told me. And so in my mind, I was like, okay, so I guess this is just like your don't pass go straight to jail card, because like I'm pretty much screwed after this. I don't know what's gonna happen. But in terms of changing or waving my magic wand and improving stuff, I'm doing my master's in criminal justice forensic psychology for this very purpose, is because I believe that everything is connected to education. The human mind is a very complex area. Everybody's different. Everybody processes things differently. But I think pretty much demolishing theories that are out there, like parent alienation, for instance, in family courts, a lot of restraining orders come through the family courts section. I think theories like those and the theories that we have already for domestic violence, I think those need to be improved and changed for education purposes. I think that there needs to be updated information that's given to judicial officials, attorneys, law enforcement, self-help desks, family court services, because it's all encompassed, and everything that happens, especially when there's children involved, domestic violence kind of goes out the window, and everything that they believe in, that they feel is best for the child when children are involved, they don't think about how domestic violence affects them. They only think about, oh, well, in developmental psychology, they say that the child needs both parents. Well, on the counter side, it also says that if someone's abusive, you should probably keep that person away from the child, or else it could lead to other things. So I think education and really improving and implementing more updated theories in that education and facts and research studies that have been done to see these results need to be implemented in that training for anybody who's involved in the judicial system.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree. I think we keep talking about education, understanding, letting people know. And we give lip service to that. I mean, I'm kind of surprised at that judge that you talked about, because in my experience, what the judge needs to do is say, okay, this is what's happening, and this is what, and so, this is what's happening. This is why you can't do this, and this, have a little explanation. And I've seen that in many cases with judges explaining, okay, this is what's in the paper, but you understand that if you call or you do anything and that person leaves, at least they are absolutely on notice. Now, I don't know what happens when what we call a default, where the person doesn't show up and you get that piece of paper. But a judge should, in every case, have a discussion. So in your case, it was a default. You got the paper. Okay, I think I'm protected.
It was swapped. It was swapped. So my ex, when I had one against him, and my trial got pushed multiple times, which is unheard of when it comes to the restraining order. I know there's a cap to how long a restraining order trial can take, the calendar. It's supposed to be, it was at 6 months. I was waiting for my permanent one. And that's like unheard of. One attorney told me that that's not even technically legal, that it was that long.
I've never heard of that. Yeah.
And exactly, it was unheard of. So in this time period, I'm driving from SoCal, where I'm staying in a safe house, to Sacramento every week to take my daughter to supervise visits with her father. And that's when his plan went into action, that he was going to start stalking me and doing things to manipulate our daughter because it was just my word versus his at this point. And he filed 3 restraining orders and was denied all 3. And on the 4th time, claimed that someone served me the 4th time. And I didn't show up because I was not served. I had no idea. And the judge took the service and gave him a restraining order before mine had even gone to trial.
Well, that's a shame because you have to file service a summons under penalty of perjury. Either somebody did it, and it can't be him; it has to be somebody else. So that's a shame.
It was a, respectfully, it was someone who was struggling with substance abuse off the street, and so he took her in and he started dating her daughter, and she signed it for him because she felt like she owed him. My attorney, my attorney out of San Francisco, my criminal attorney, found all this out afterwards. Mr. Goodman, who's a great attorney.
Goodness.
So, he was able to find that out.
Wow. Annabelle, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I am so sorry.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be rude, but I have to go. I have another board meeting that I have to attend. And so
Not a problem.
I really apologize, but I do thank you so much for this opportunity. It has been an absolute honor being on here. I really do thank you. And I'm sorry that I have to go. I wish I could stay on longer.
Don't be sorry. Listen, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this again.
Okay.
Because then I want all 4 of you. I want to do a little of my own research. I want to check with actually my daughter, the police officer daughter. I have 3 daughters, but one's a police officer daughter. I want to talk with her a little bit about what training. I want to talk to the courts. I want to talk to the person I know very well in Contra Costa who heads the domestic violence unit in our DA's office where I was. And I want to talk to my friend, a judge, who just was recently transferred from the family law to the DV court. So I want to get a little, but I think it's very good. And I'll talk to Don. Let's do this again soon and kind of get some answers. And then I have some ideas about the legislature and all that. I think this could, so just because you have to leave, let's not. I do want to, you can leave. I do want to chat with Nicolette a little bit because she didn't get to tell me her. And we'll talk a little more, but we're going to reconvene. Okay, fair, everybody?
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. You guys have a wonderful evening. Take care.
You too.
Annabelle.
Take care. If you found this information about domestic violence interesting and helpful, stay tuned for our next episode of No Holds Barred.